Hello and welcome back to Custodes Central. We will be going over a high-level summary of the matchups today. We will have timestamps in the description of the video, so if there's only a few matchups that you're interested in, you can just skip to those. I've continued in the style of long videos just because I think it's nice to have everything in one place. It's probably really bad for the view count, but if people would really prefer that I break down the videos to, I don't know, 5, 10, 12 minutes, I can certainly look into that if it makes watching a long video kind of daunting. Anyway, so before we begin, let's start off with some disclaimers. So everything and the future slides is going to be based on my opinion and my experience, so yours may differ. If you have different opinions and views, do let me know in the comments. It all helps the algorithm if we get a discussion going in the comment section. Everything's also based on me playing almost exclusively on WTC terrain. I play all of my games on TTS. And I've been told, there are some elements of the terrain which are slightly different from in real life play, such as some of the ruins being very, very tall, and as a result, people being able to hide their kind of 18 plus win models much easier than they would do on a real life table. The difficulty of the matchups can change a lot depending on who goes first, so I've kind of averaged it out as if, you play 100 times, you're going to go first 50 and second 50 times. And it's also going to assume that both you and your opponent have a good understanding of secondaries and deployment, and that you are of similar skill, and that both of you are kind of playing pretty well and you're not making huge kind of errors anywhere. And for the shield host, I've assumed that you're Shadow Keepers. I don't think it will super change that many of the matchups, but I don't have good familiarity with playtesting a lot of the other factions. I think I've only played Red Host for like maybe 5 or 6 games, and the others not at all. So if you do play another Shield Host and you think this changes some of the matchups significantly, do let me know. Right, so let's start off nice and easy. When we are playing Tau, I think this is a relatively easy matchup for us. It's probably one of the easiest ones that we could get in the game. And just their key units in the matchups are really the Riptide with the Relic Gun. It has lots of damage, lots of shots when they overcharge, and they get the 3-up invul. So in this one, it's really nice if you get to go first and you get line of sight onto the Riptides, because you can blast it before it gets a 3-up invul. Another kind of really good unit for Tau here, I think, are Remora drones in Farsight Enclave, because they are able to do potentially quite a lot of mortal wounds to you with their stratagem. I mean, it kind of depends on how much you castle up, etc. But also, more significantly, is the move blocking. If you don't have a lot of flying units, they might be able to keep you back kind of in their deployment zone and force you to shoot them to kind of get out of your own deployment zone. And they could, potentially have some advanced deploy units like their stealth units onto primaries, which could give them kind of a head start. Their broadsides, always pretty scary with their railguns and their smart missile systems. If they've gone for a custom sept, they can get quite a lot of AP while ignoring cover and just force you to make a lot of saves. I still don't think it's a scary matchup for most Custodes players because Tau are kind of, I think they're slightly overpriced. They could do with maybe, I don't know, like a 20% haircut in costs to become kind of competitive. And then fusion squads are also kind of scary for Custodes because obviously we don't have a lot of models, but fusions tend to kill stuff that they shoot at. So our key units in the matchup are the Vexilla Magnifica. I think this is by far the most important one against Tau. Tau are a very shooty faction, and they don't have really good ballistic skill. They're mainly BS4, so pushing them to 5s is really good. Telemons are really good to absorb shots. Obviously they don't have to shoot the Telemon, but if they don't, once it gets into combat and it's now active in 2 phases of the game, it's quite a lot of damage output. So you're essentially forcing them to shoot your Telemon as long as you're moving it up the board aggressively. And then anything fast in your army, so things like bikes, Minotauri, and even bike captains are really good in this matchup just because you can get up the board faster and start getting into combat faster. So the plan in the game is really just close the distance and get into combat as fast as possible, because while you could have a good shooting war with Tau, and depending on how, if their army list is built badly, I suppose you could win a shooting war against Tau, but typically your advantage is going to be in the melee. And typically how I play against Tau is I tend to go for the drones first on turn 1. This sounds kind of weird, but I think killing the drones when you target them directly is much easier than when you have to kill the drones through Savior Protocol, because then they get the benefit of their toughness on the actual model that you're shooting. And then just keep in mind for the greater good before you make charges, and try and figure out, if they high roll slightly on their overwatches, is there enough that survives the overwatch for you to make the charge, and is that charge still effective in clearing the unit or flipping the objective, etc. And that's kind of it for Tau. It's a hard time to be a Tau player, I think, in 9th. We go to the next matchup. We're looking at Astra Militarum. Again, I think this is a pretty easy one. Their key units are tank commanders with demo cannons, and they will typically have spotter detail 4 plus 6-inch range, so they'll have 30-inch demo cannons, and gunnery expert, so they get to reroll 1d6 the number of shots. And because of the way grinding and violence works on the Layman Russ, they'll effectively get to shoot twice with a demo cannon for 2d6, and they'll be able to re-roll each d6 because they're each individual instances of shooting. Manticores with full payload. Obviously this doesn't benefit much from spotter detail, but it does benefit from gunnery expert. So they go from 2d6 and they get to re-roll 1, and this changes their average, I think, to 8.2 shots instead of 7. Full payload is going to give them flat 3 damage, which is obviously horrendous against Custodes, so it can be a pretty rough time for you to be kind of a Sagittarium not in light cover, or Venatari not in light cover. There are other kind of units that I tend to see a lot are Bulgrin with Mauls, and they'll typically take an Astropath with a Psychic Power to give them +1 to their save, and then they can use a stratagem for another +1 to their save, and so the Bulgrin with the Slab Shields can end up with a 0+ save, which means things like your Venatari shooting them makes them save on 2s, which is not that good. And then they'll typically take a bunch of infantry and all scions for primary secondaries. They may or may not take a bunch of chimeras. Spamming chimeras is kind of a problem for Custodes because we don't have that much anti-armor shooting. But that shouldn't really cause you that many problems in the game. So our key unit here again against the shooty faction, Vexilla Magnifica, is really, really good. It's causing a massive reduction in their shooting output because they're generally BS4. Obviously the attack commanders are BS3 reroll 1s, but just pushing the hit rolls back is really beneficial. I think salvo bikes are actually pretty good into this matchup, just because they allow you to nuke a tank commander with the shooting, and then you get to charge something else, so you get to be active in 2 phases, and you really do need to kill the tank commanders. Same with the Venatari. If you pop superior fire patterns and blood game veterans, you're pretty likely to kill a tank commander in shooting as well. So now in one turn you could kill 2 tank commanders in your shooting phase, and that typically does wrap up the game. If they have kind of a different army, or they have even more shooting, you might have to have another good turn. But the fact that the Venatari also should be able to get a charge off afterwards, so now you're cleaning up kind of minimum 4 units in that turn, should kind of mean that you just win. If they've done like a more cagey deployment and you're having to move up the board and you don't get to fully obscure these units and you have to take a whole turn of shooting, then things can get more dicey. And in those kind of deployments, you should very strongly consider kind of auto advancing the bikes if you can get them somewhere safe and obscured. And with the Venatari, just roll the advance roll and use a CP roll if you need to. Salamanders with storm cannons really good here because they're just durable. They're not as good into Astra Militarum because the tank commanders can use, I think it's Hail of Fire, so they'll do auto max shots with a demo cannon against Salamanders, and because it's strength 10, you don't get really the value out of Grim Responsibility. So they're still winning on 3s, and that can do quite a lot of damage. But they're still really good for being durable, and they still do have to deal with your Telemon because, again, if it gets into combat, you can be active in 2 phases, and you start to get pretty efficient with it. And a bike captain with the Auric Aquila and the I don't know what it's called now, Superior Creation for the 5-up Feel No Pain. It's really good because, again, it's just a single fast unit, and Astra Militarum have a lot of kind of tank units with blast, so once you bad touch them, you're taking out a lot of their shooting. And although a bike captain is an expensive unit, you should be pretty willing to kind of trade a bike captain to turn off a tank commander or a manticore for a turn or 2, like very easily, because as long as you turn off their significant shooting, the game should be pretty easy. So yeah, so the plan is just, again, kind of against Tau, like move up the board, advance if you need to, abuse multi-level ruins if you have access to them with your flying units, and try and kill the tank commanders ASAP. If you ever have a choice between a tank commander or a manticore, obviously they're not the same in terms of ease of killing, but you should be typically going for the tank commander just because they have way higher output than the Manticores do, especially if you have a Vexilla, because now they're hitting on 5s, whereas the tank commander will be hitting on 4s, rerolling 1s, unless you unless you still have the CP to turn off rerolls, and turning off rerolls for just reroll 1s doesn't feel that great. So in the early turns, I'd focus on army preservation and trying to move up the board to set up like a nice a decisive turn where you kill all their hammer units. And then you might need to play catch up and clean up their army in the later turns, but that should typically be fine. So let's have a look at another matchup, Craftworld Eldar. I think this is relatively easy. If you end up on a map without good terrain and you don't have any shooting and your army's really slow and they've gone full Mech Dar, you could have problems because they could just kind of shoot you off the board, but hopefully your army construction has enough shooting in it. And fast units. So their key units are really the Farseer and the Warlock. The Farseer can give stuff guide to reroll failed hits. Can give them Doom on one of your units to reroll failed wounds. Obviously, Emperor's Auspice is really good here to cancel that. So if they're good, they won't stack it on the same unit. The guided unit won't be shooting the Doomed unit because then you get too much value of Emperor's Auspice. The Warlock's pretty interesting for Jinx. It'll -1 to your saves and your invul saves. I think that's the main one for Warlocks. They also have access to kind of it's Quicken. It's effectively warp time. They can use it on their Shining Spears depending on your unit squad size for what's holding the backfield. Potentially could be scary if you're just trying to hold the backfield objectives with unsupported 3 Sagittarium. The Shining Spears could come and nuke them off an objective, but generally if you're holding, if you have kind of larger squads, you probably don't care about it that much. What it does give them access to is Psychic Ritual, where they bounce a unit from behind Obscuring into the middle of the board to do Psychic Ritual and then bounce them back with Quicken. But that's quite a significant kind of cost for the Eldar player because that's less kind of Psychic powers in terms of output, and at some points that aren't really taking part in the battle, but on a defensive map that could become relevant. The Lynx is a really good unit for Craftworld Eldar. It's got flat 3 damage, it's strength 9, so you're not getting as much value with Grim Responsibility onto your Telemon, because now they're still winning on 4s instead of 3s. It's still worth doing, but it's not as good as pushing them to 5s from 4s. D cannons, especially if they are expert crafters for the reroll 1 hit roll and reroll 1 wound roll, very efficient because they're strength 10 as well. They're getting d6 shots and it's indirect shooting, and if they take a lot of them, they can they split them up into individual units. They go into while we stand we fight. It can be a bit awkward to try and clear them all, but mainly it's the firepower that if they pick a secondary selection versus you where they can play it very defensively because they have ritual, for example, and you have to push into their army, it can be kind of spooky going into them, but hopefully you brought a Vex as well, because again this is a primarily shooting faction. Shadow Spectres are pretty interesting. They're made of paper. If you get a turn with line of sight to them, you can shoot them a lot. So keep in mind Spec scan against Shadow Spectres. It's always really worthwhile because if they get a full squad of 10 down and then they get to shoot you with their kind of focused profile, they're going to be, I think, strength 5 or 6, and they're going to be -3, and they're going to be flat 3, and that will eat a lot of your units up, especially your infantry, if they're not into your shield guards. So if you don't, this could kill like a Venetari squad if they roll well, especially if they get buffs onto it and you don't have CP, or you've allocated your stratagem somewhere else earlier in the shooting phase, or in the enemy shooting phase. And then Shining Spears, they're really fast. I've had a fun experience playing against, I think, like 20 or 30 of them with a unit of bikes, and I was really scared that they were going to get the charge off, and obviously they were always going to get the charge off because they're much faster than my bikes are. And eventually when it happened, they basically just bounced off my bikes because I used stratagems and they didn't do a lot of damage, and I murdered them back in my turn. So typically, if you have bikes, don't be too scared of Shining Spears as long as you have CP available. So our key units here are the Vexilla, again because Craftworld are a primarily shooting army. Sisters of Silence can be good just because they rely a lot in the psychic phase, and if you can push them into the middle of the board and they're kind of obscured and now they have to take tests at -1, and they were really relying on certain powers to go off, or you get to hard deny something on a 3+, that's really good. I still think Bikes and Venetari are good here. I think Eldar I think the Telemon is kind of less good or important to have into Craftworld because while it's still good at tanking shots, you don't typically have a great unit to melee into. I think you generally rather have more shooting against Craftworld because they tend to be a pretty fast army anyway. And unless they effectively make it's kind of a mistake if they ever let their links kind of get into melee range of a Telemon, for example. Suppose it could happen in the later turns if they just run out of board space to back away from you. I just don't think it's as important as having like bikes and Venetari. So again, it's the same sort of game plan. Just close the distance, try and get to melee, and try and outscore them on primary. Should be relatively easy because although they're fast and they can get onto the primaries faster than you, they don't really have good units to hold primaries because they don't have obsec that's durable. And they can kind of brawl it out for them, whereas you have lots of durable, brawly obsec units. So we can go to the next matchup, and that's Orks. Now, I haven't got that many games against Orks, and I find Orks can be a really hard matchup, or it can be a really easy matchup. And I think just the nature of the faction, you get a lot of really good players playing Orks, and they can do some pretty fun stuff with it. And you also get a lot of for fun players with Orks. So in rating the difficulty, I think it's kind of difficult as well because they don't have always the same kind of army archetype. They can go a lot of ways. They can go bike heavy, they can go buggy heavy, they can go plane heavy, they can go boy heavy, they can bring a custom stomper. They can do quite a lot of things. But I still think it's on the easy to medium side of all the matchups that exist. So their key units are stuff like 30 boys, and they can do endless tide. So if they do go the 30 boys route, just keep in mind that when you shoot into these units, you want to do a little bit of chip damage, or you want to wipe them out. You don't want to bring them down to like 7 or 8 models because then they'll just bring them back off a board edge and then they can make a charge off you, which would be sad. The buff characters I think are the Mech boy. They're gonna have like the custom force field giving everyone a 5-up invul, and then they're gonna have the pain boy giving them a 6-up feel no pain. And then they're going to have the weird boy allowing them to use the jump every turn. So screening kind of becomes important, but also you have to think about it as a sacrificial screen because a 9-inch charge for Orks just isn't that difficult. Mech guns, people can bring like 15 of them. That's really good for them for while we stand we fight because they split into units of 5 and they split into individual units, so kind of separating out all that damage to finish off the unit for while we stand we fight is really difficult. And also their guns are really not bad, and because of the way that they tend to work where they're trying to roll over your toughness, transhuman doesn't have much value there. The burner bomber, I don't know how common it is, but against custodes in particular it's very dangerous if you do like a castle deployment, and that can happen very often if they're kind of a shooty faction, if they're like a shooty Orks version, because obviously they have garbage ballistic skill and pushing them to 6s is really good. But if you bubble up all around your Vexilla, now a burner bomber headbutt stratagem is really bad because they're going to auto explode for 3 mortal wounds for everything within 6, and obviously custodes are really expensive, and they get to drop their bomb and then they get to auto explode, and that's just, they're very capable of getting their points back just by suiciding even before the shooting phase with burner bombers. So if you do see burner bombers on the other side, and you should probably be shooting for them fast. And the custom stomper, faced this once. I've been told that it's really uncommon, and you're unlikely to face it in real games. That could be true. I've come across it once on TTS. It was not a good time, and I've seen it being played into a tournament on TTS as well, and I think it's going to give a lot of lists a lot of problems. You can think it's kind of gatekeeper, versus custodes. If you end up on a map where you don't have really good tall obscuring in the middle of the board, you may struggle a lot into the custom stomper because it's so big, it's so tall, it can basically see the whole map. If you have obstacles, but they're not tall enough, because of the height of the custom stomper, it can just see everything. It's got an insane amount of guns. It's got a lift to drop a gun that again ignores transhuman because it's just trying to roll over your toughness. I think on 3d6 now, you have no chance. Things are just going to get deleted, like multiple units. So our key units here are the Vexilla Magnifica. It's really good against shooting Orks. Talons are always good just to absorb kind of random shots and things, and again, you know, they're really good to get stuck into combat because, you know, once they're stuck into combat, the speaker that's shooting 10 shots, you know, you've got your flamers. Your guns aren't going to be that efficient into mobs or boys, but and you're not going to be holding the objective versus boys as well because they're obsec. But Talons are they're just never going to die, you know, unless they charge it with something like Gaz or I don't know, I forgot what they're called. They're like the Dreadnought Nob units. They're not Dreadnoughts. They're like in the equivalent of Ork Terminator armor with the buzzsaws and things. I think anything with a lot of shots is really good into Orks. So Venatori really good with superior fire patterns, helps you kill a lot of boys, or even Aquilon Terminators because they get, I think they're going to get 40 shots for a squad of 5 with superior fire patterns. And into the Ork Horde, you're really looking for volume of fire versus quality of fire. Just keep in mind your shots probably won't do as much damage as you think because they have the 5 of Bimbo and then the 6 up Feel No Pain. So don't expect to wipe the whole squad, but it is important to be able to whittle them down. Ideally, you'd want to be able to kill 2 units of 30 in a turn, but you definitely need to be able to kill at least 1 a turn. And then a unit of 5 Shield Guard I think are really good because again, while you're not going to hold the objective, they are just going to not die when you get them stuck in a prolonged melee. They don't need that much you know, stratagem support, if any. Depends on the kind of loadout that they have. And you know, even if they have AP1, you don't care with Shield Guard because you're on a 1-up, it goes to a 2-up. You get to shoot your pistols into combat, gives you more weight of dice, and you know, you get to do your slashy attacks. And then, you know, if you lose a model or 2, it's fine because you just do Avenge the Fallen. So now you go back to kind of your previous turn in terms of the amount of output you had in melee. So the plan is to wipe out 30 boy units at a time, or spread the chip damage out so you can set up for a wipe the next turn. What you don't want to do is kind of, you know, again, put them down to like 7, 8, 9 models, and then they get full value with Endless Tide. And then also respect their charge distance. So while Tanglefoot is still good, because Orks can do a pick and mix reroll on their charge distances, and they can get bonuses to charge, etc., and they can get rerolling charges. It's really not the same as other factions in difficulty for them making, you know, a 7, 8, 9, even a 10-inch charge. And the Custom Stomper, if you happen to come across it and you don't have good terrain and you lose, wouldn't feel bad because you probably almost certainly do not have the firepower to kill it in a pure Custodes army. And if you can't approach it because you don't have enough obscuring terrain, you just get picked up off the board and there's not a lot you can do about it. So this is just one of these hard counters, and it's kind of map dependent. But if that happens, you know, you don't have to beat your head into a wall thinking, you know, what did you do wrong? I think you just ran into one of those bad matchups. Tyranids. I think this is a medium difficulty matchup. I think their key units are Hive Guard. Hive Guard are really good because they're going to be in the Cronus detachment. If they stand still, they're going to reroll 1s to hit, and they're going to use the stratagem to fire twice, and they're going to have the Neurothrope giving them Symbiostorm for exploding 6s. And indirect fire is really awkward to face because Custodes don't have indirect fire themselves unless they want to soup in, and this can cause you to have cause you a lot of problems, especially if you want to be kind of greedy in how little you want to leave on backfield objectives while you go fight for the middle objectives. Necrons obviously really good in Kraken. You know, they have the 5-up invul save, they have Delicta Leaper rule, so they don't have fly, but I think it's kind of better than fly. I mean, they're still going to be able to be tangle-footed, and they still have to take the penalty for dense, but the fact that they can jump over terrain without taking the movement penalty like they would do in fly is really strong. And obviously they're going to combo well with things like the Swarm Lord and Onslaught and Opportunistic Advance for double the advance value, so they can, you know, they could move, they could double the advance, and they're going to roll the advance on 3d6, so it's very likely to be a 5 or a 6. They double that value, they get to move again, they get to still charge. So this gives them like a 48 threat range for one Daemons if they want to do Onslaught and Hive Guard and Opportunistic Advance in the Daemons. Typically they would split that out over 2 Daemons, so 2 of them get a 36-inch kind of threat range. Their Exocrines are also really good because you know, they're going to get 12 shots if they don't move, and even if they do move, they can use a stratagem to count as if they didn't move. They can go to damage 3. It's kind of expensive. It's probably worth it against Custodes because we have so many 3-wound models. Swarmlord and Hive Tyrant, I think you're pretty much always going to see in a Tyranids list. That you're going to see 1 or 2 for Scramblers. You're going to see some Gaunts for primaries, and if you see a squad of like 20 or 30 Hormagaunts, you know, keep in mind that while you may hold a primary, if they decide to commit them in, yes, they may lose most of the squad if they charge into like your, you know, your 5 Shield Guard or your 5 Sagittarium who also have Misericordias, etc. But they will be able to flip that objective for the turn, and that can often result in like a 10-point swing because you know, you lose 5 points and they get to score more. And so you need to kind of always keep that in the back of your mind when you're thinking about who's winning, who's losing, who needs to be more aggressive, who needs to be more defensive, who can sit back and kind of force the other player to make less optimal moves because they're under points pressure. And then an interesting kind of tech choice that you see from time to time are Biovores. They will very often kind of move, even though they're heavy, so that they take a -1 to hit, because they're not actually trying to hit you. They would much prefer not to hit you, but they would prefer to miss. And when they miss, their spore mines end up within somewhere between 3 and 6 inches of the target that they aim for. But what this can do is this can move Bogby if you don't have fly, and this can just prevent you from moving up onto the board and onto primaries and result in a turn 1 primary deficit. What they can't do is stop you doing banners, because the spore mines don't count for kind of victory condition purposes, so they don't prevent your banners from going up. But if they can prevent, you know, your army moving onto the objectives, or setting up to be able to protect an objective on turn 2, if you know, if the Tyranids player has got onto it, that can be a pretty big deal. And because they're at the back, you can kind of it can be problematic to get to them, especially if they screen it out, so you may just have to deal with that. So while this sounds like a horrible matchup, it does also mean that into a lot of other armies, the Biovores aren't good into other matchups for the Tyranids player, so I don't think it's a very common pick, but it can be problematic for Custodes when it happens. So I think our key units here are the Talamon, the Aculus, and to a certain extent even the Galatus. And that's because these units all allow you to trade pretty favorably with a Dimorcharon. If you don't have a lot of dreads, the Dimorcharons, you know, just crashing into your lines can be really problematic, especially if they manage to get a turn 1 charge. So again, in this matchup, you know, try and deploy a bit further back to deny them like easy turn 1 charges, which are good, and always set up so you get to have a good counterpunch. The Vexilla is good because Tyranids have actually pretty good shooting. It's very likely that they're going to outshoot you, especially with their rangers. Venatari is still good because this allows you to dump a lot of damage onto, you know, allows you to kill an X-Creen, Swarmlord, Hive Tyrant, Dimorcharon. You know, you're not going to kill a Dimorcharon, but you do a lot of wounds to a Dimorcharon with superior fire patterns with Venatari. And you really want to be in a position where your list can kill kind of 2 of them in a turn when they're in range to be shot and charged. Bikes with salvo are really good, again, for being able to shoot stuff and charge stuff. You have to really make sure that they're not the target of the charge from the Dimorcharons, because if you do take a unit of bikes and they get shot with the Hive Guard and then they get charged by the Dimorcharons, it's very likely you've made the matchup extremely difficult for yourself. So do what you need to do in terms of wrapping, screening them, because the Dimorcharons are large models. You know, just avoid their landing spots, you know, for charges or for their move, for like how far they can move within the lance, for example. And Ares is actually really good into Tyranids because they have enough. They typically will have enough kind of targets that are good for you to shoot into. You're going to pop an Execrane, no problem. You know, it's worth rolling into a Swarmlords just with a 4-up invul, because now you get rid of, you know, A, a Psyker, and B, the Hive Commander ability. Obviously the Ares isn't good into a lot of other matchups, which is why I don't recommend people to take an Ares into their kind of general take all comers list. But if you're into list tailoring and you're facing Tyranids and you are having trouble and you do have access to an Ares is pretty good here. Sisters of Silence, yeah, they're going to get murdered by almost anything that looks at them, including Gaunts. But it is still good to, if you can force them up into kind of the middle of the board and they're behind obscuring, and the Hive God obviously won't want to shoot them, but they might do because now you're you're pushing kind of their psychic tests back by 1, and you've got a chance to hard deny on a 3-up. And the Tyranids, you know, this army in particular has a lot of psychic powers that it wants to go off. The key ones probably being Onslaught and Catalyst. Catalyst giving them the 5-up Feel No Pain. The Necrons will get 5-up Feel No Pains as long as they eat a model after they kill a model in a unit. It's not so guaranteed against Custodes because we're base strength 5. But you know, it's very nice for them to be able to put Catalyst on lots of their units. It increases their survivability a lot. So the plan here is to protect your hammer units. Your hammer units are typically going to be, you know, your salvo bikes and your Venatori. If you have an Ares, yeah, you don't really need to protect it. It can't be charged by anything other than a flying hive tyrant or other kind of flying units. I can't, you know, unless it's got like a Harridan or something crazy. You don't really need to worry about protecting your Ares. So mainly, yeah, it's going to be protect your bikes and your Venatori, and so they can't be the target of the charge, and set up that you can counterpunch. And again, the Talamons, the Achilles, and even to a lesser extent the Galatus are really good countercharge units because it's difficult for a Daemon to kill an Achilles. I mean, you know, you just turn off the rerolls and then you're kind of fine. And on your swing backs, your damage is going to be absolutely horrendous into them with 3+ D3 hitting on 2s because you don't degrade, and you're going to be wounding on, I think it's 2s again. So you're just going to do a horrendous amount of damage back to them, and obviously an Achilles is cheaper than a Daemon, and a Telamon, there's no chance that they're going to one-turn it. I mean, I suppose you could roll really horrendously, but it's realistically not going to happen, and again, you get to punch back super hard versus Daemons. Especially if you have Trojan behind, because you're going to hit on 2s and wound on 2s. So yes, deploy in a way so you can clean primaries while protecting them from a counterpunch unit. So that means you want to make sure that you, in turn 1, are able to get your units to something that to a location that has good line of sight to primaries, so you can clean them off it. Because obviously Tyranids and Kraken are very fast, and they're going to be able to spread all over the board if they want to, and get into all sorts of positions of the primaries. The problematic ones are where there is obscuring terrain that kind of splits an objective, or covers or obscures an objective entirely from where you are. So try and deploy in a way so that you can shoot them off it, otherwise you're quite likely to end up in primary deficit from turn 1, from turn 2 when they score, and then that could be pretty problematic for you. And then if you end up on a 3-3 map, just be careful, because they could go for banners, while we stand we fight, and then ritual using Hive Commander. It's pretty funny, but I've done it, and I've had it done to me, where they literally use Hive Commander all game just for the flying Hive Tyrant to move to the middle of the board, do Psychic Ritual, Hive Commander back behind obscuring. Really, really annoying, and it will force you to push into them, because obviously you're both going to score 40 points for primary unless you go and fight with each other, and you're going to have to go to the other side of the board to mess up the while we stand we fight, and you're probably going to struggle with ritual, especially if you don't have if you don't have Sisters of Silence, or you have the Warlord trait for Impregnable Mind to kind of battle the Psychic Ritual from taking place, and frankly the Hive Tyrant is probably going to have the Barbed Resonance Relic, so they're going to be +1 to cast, and you need to beat their Psychic score by another one for Deny the Witch, so just be mindful of that. So let's go to the next matchup, Sisters of Battle. Now, it's hard to place a difficulty onto this matchup, and it's because I think the difficulty of the matchup heavily depends on how many Telamons and Dreadnoughts that you have brought into your list. So their key units are Repentia, super cheap, super killy, with Miracle Dice. They've got insane threat ranges. What they're not super killy into are our Dreadnoughts, because of -1 damage reduction and because we're toughness 7 or 8. Retributor's obviously really good with the melter guns. They don't take the penalty for moving and shooting with the heavy, and they've got the cherub, so they get a lot of shots, and when they get a shot through they can do really good spike damage with their Miracle Dice. Zephyrim are less of a problem for Custodes, because you can generally fend them off, especially if you have CP to turn off their rerolls for their rerolling wounds. But they are a very fast unit, and if you have kind of 3 Sagittarium at the back of the board or something like that, they can swoop in and they can definitely lay some hurt down, and if you're unable to get something back, to help support them, you could definitely lose that combat, especially in the later turns, and obviously they're really fast, so if you kind of have a OBSEC light army, they could obviously steal something from you. If you have kind of vehicles holding in the back, you know, for some reason you have like a Caladius or a Rhino trying to hold something for super cheap, it's a pretty dangerous unit. And then Rhinos. Obviously the Rhino's not going to kill anything, but it does force you to have anti-tank shooting, so you can kill the Repentia or the Retributors that are hiding inside. You know, they've got 6-up invols, and if they've got, I think the Triumph of St. Catherine, you know, they can effectively save it on 5s, because they can just manipulate the dice, and you know, they can use more miracle dice, and it can be problematic really to kill the Rhinos. So this is why I always kind of try and push the agenda that even though you're a Custodes list and you think they've got good melee, you still need really good shooting to fight the variety of opponents that you're going to do in a competitive environment. So our key units here really are Telemons and other dreads. I think the Galatus is better than the Aculus into Sisters by far, just because of durability, more attacks. You know, you don't need 3+ D3 swings. You don't need the Adrathic Destructors in shooting. You need, you know, you want auto hits for Overwatch. You want lots of auto hits when you're shooting into combat. And you want nice sweep attacks. You don't get sweep attacks with the Galatas, but you do get the additional D3 attacks, etc. And you're -1 to hit. And you get a 4-up invul. So this is all good into Repentia and Retributors, because obviously -1 damage and the kind of high toughness allow you to get value out of Grim's Responsibility. And the -1 damage against Repentia is actually very, very relevant. So if you can absorb the charges from the Repentia to the extent that you haven't managed to murder them all in your shooting, this is way better than, you know, if Repentia get a charge onto your Vanetari or your bikes or something like that, or even like your Terminators, because obviously your Ignore AP1, AP2 strat is not going to help you against Repentia here. I think bike units are a huge liability into Sisters of Battle, just because they are very, very expensive. You're likely going to get one turn where they get to shoot and maybe charge something, and after that they are very likely going to get countercharged or shot, and this just allows them to trade up massively in terms of points. And while the game isn't entirely based around point value trading, the extremity here is very large, right? If they manage to kill like a 400 point unit of bikes with 144 points of Repentia, that's probably game winning for them, because you're not going to have enough stuff left to kill their army. So yeah, for this reason, this matchup is why I don't generally tend to favor bikes, and bikes into this matchup is going to be very, very difficult. You know, if you have 2 units of 5 bikes, I think you can kind of write off this matchup typically, I think. If you have Hurricane bikes, it becomes a bit better, because obviously most of the melt is wasted unless you really need it to pop the Rhinos, which it still can be really helpful to do. But Hurricanes tend to be much better into Sisters here, because unless they're Valorous Heart, well actually no, it won't matter because they're AP0 anyway, but just having more shots to murder the little Repentia is really strong. So what else is good? Fast multi-shot shooting. So Palace and Venatari I think are really good into Sisters. And then the Vexilla is also really helpful against the Retributors. So the plan is to pop as many Rhinos as you can and shoot as many Repentia as you can, and then also shoot the Retributors. You can kind of almost ignore everything else for the early turns. If you have a choice between Retributors or Repentia, figure out if the Repentia are in mechs, are in a potential charge range, and that's typically, I think it's 27 inches if they have all the miracle dice and they're inside of a Rhino. Obviously 27 inches is really, really far, even with, you know, and then you can try and calculate the Tanglefoot, but a lot of times Tanglefoot won't help you that much. It can do if you manage to get it off and you get a good value, but it feels really awkward to rely on a good Tanglefoot value to be able to do that, and especially if, you know, they have obscuring in the way, so or no, the obscuring won't matter for Tanglefoot anyway. But try not to rely on Tanglefoot to stop the charges. Just try and pop the Rhinos. Even popping the Rhinos will kind of stop a lot of their 3 inches of free movement when they disembark. Obviously they can emergency disembark after the vehicle's been destroyed, plus 3 inches forward. but they might not want to do that because that might leave them in line of fire for the rest of your shooting turn. So Tanglefoot and Auspex really good here, especially if they want to strategic reserve these units. So try and save a bit of CP, especially if they do have stuff into Deep Strike. And yeah, the primary focus is just kill the Repentia and the Retributors. If you have a choice and the Repentia are in charge range, definitely kill the Repentia. And the reason is, if you have a Vex up and you have CP, you can Transhuman, you can Grim Responsibility, and you're -1 to hit, and you can turn off rerolls versus the Retributors. You can tank actually quite a lot of shots, you know, as long as you don't roll terribly on your saves. But if you do get charged by a unit of 10 Repentia, there's almost nothing you can do against a non-Dreadnought unit, because even if you pop all the strats, the unit's probably still going to die. So for that reason, I think the Repentia are way scarier than the Retributors. And try to avoid multi-core combats with Sisters, because they can interrupt you, and if they have multiple combats with Repentia, it's just not good for you to be in combat with Repentia, period. And that is the Sisters matchup. So here's a bit of a change. Imperial Knights, both Imperial and the Chaos variety. I think the Chaos variety is much harder because of their kind of, they have special rules for, I think, infernal houses or demonic things, and they can like increase their movement, they can make their strength and damage higher on their guns, and I think this is just way stronger than what the Imperial Knights version are able to do. I think the super key unit here is the Magira Knights, and whether or not they have a small detachment for objectives and secondaries. I think if they're playing pure Knights, it's obviously much easier because you get to play the missions much better, you get to play primaries much better. But typically they will take a small soup detachment so they can get, you know, they can hold objectives in the back, or they can like flip objectives with you if they have like a 10-man unit of, I don't know, Astra Militarum, or you know, even Skitari, or cultists or something, because while you have OBSEC, you know, you probably only have 3, 4, 5 on an objective, and they can just shove 10 onto it with, you know, something like move, and now, you know, they can do stuff like scramblers and banners and all this other stuff that they wouldn't ordinarily be able to do if they don't have it. Why is the Magira so good? Their combat weapon is basically better feet because they still get 3 times the attacks, same as Titanic, but they're -3 AP and they're flat 3 damage, so that's really good. They also have like effectively an auto wounding thing against infantry where they wound you on 2s. It's AP 0, which is nice into Custodes, but it's flat 3, so now you've got to be really careful about Overwatch. The lightning gun gets double exploding 6s, so you know, they shoot 8 times. It's like they hit 8 times on average, unless you have like a -1. It's only strength 7, so it's not terribly efficient at killing your Telemons, because they're toughness 8, and even your other dreadnoughts, if you have them all vehicles, you can pop Grim Responsibility and they wound you on 5s, but they have good damage too because they're flat 3 as well. So our key units here are, this is another kind of selective matchup where an Ares would be really good, because the Ares is toughness 8 and it's hard to hit. It's going to be very difficult for Magira to kind of shoot it down, and they don't fly, so they can't tag you in combat either. And obviously you have great targets to hit with an Ares. Salvo bikes are also pretty good into Magira, obviously because you can shoot them with the melter, you can charge them, you pop Slayer of Nightmares, they don't have damage reduction, so you've got a really good chance of killing stuff with bikes here. The main thing is just you have to be really careful as to who gets the charge, because obviously if they get the charge into you, this is going to be very, very sad for your bikes. Caladius with Arachnus Heavy makes an appearance here. Typically I don't like this in Take All Comers list because the output from the gun just isn't that good, but this is definitely one of the matchups where it's actually worth having strength 9 guns with 3 plus D3 damage and rerolling versus vehicles. And the range is also really nice. Telemons with storm cannons or even Aculus are good because, again, if you can get them into combat, it's super good. Just keep in mind Magiras in combat are really scary because they're going to do, I think it's like flat 6 damage into you. Might even be more than that, might be 7 or 8, depending on the household that they have and the traits that they have, etc. Like Crast Magiras with I think Headhunter is super terrifying because I think they do like flat 7 or 8 into you before damage reduction. Vexilla's always good because, you know, they have guns, and making guns at -1 is always really good. Aquilon Terminators actually could be pretty good here. You do like the classic Custodes play where you have a Telemon as the football blocker, you have the Vexilla behind, so his character protected by the Telemon, and then turn 2, you know, turn 1 you advance, turn 2 you advance, you Vex Homer, you get them up 3 inches within the Vex, 6 inches within the Vex, and 3 away from them, and then you make a charge with your Aquilons, and obviously Aquilons, with their fists, you give them +1 to wound, they're wounding on 2s, and they typically don't have good saves into combat unless they took like a relic for the 2-up, but even that's not going to save them that much against kind of a lot of attacks. So Aquilon Terminators could be good here as long as you have the Vex, and then here you probably also want Trajan for the CP kind of thing, but you know, if you don't have Aquilon Terminators, it can be okay. So you look at the key units here, and you'll realize, like, yes, while this can be a kind of a good to easy matchup, your typical list won't actually have an Ares. You may or may not have Salvo Bikes. You probably don't have Caladius with heavy Blaze, and you may or may not have Terminators. So it's actually not that easy of a matchup, just because you actually just don't have enough anti-tank shooting, probably. And because they're also pretty fast, you don't really have the mobility advantage. So you're not really guaranteed to control the engagements. You might not get the charges off, etc. And especially if they're Imperial Knights, they can advance and charge. So now you're at a mobility disadvantage in terms of who gets to get the charge off. So while this all sounds pretty rough, take solace in the fact that because there's so much Melter spam, there are much less Knight lists playing around. So kind of spicy take, while Custodes are generally complaining about the Melter spam, what they don't realize is that the Melter spam prevents armor heavy lists from being more prevalent in the meta, and that's better than the Melter spam because we struggle more with heavy armor lists than we do with Melter heavy lists, in my opinion. So the plan generally here is going to be play to the mission and don't focus on killing the knights. If you do decide that your army composition has enough to give it a fight, you can definitely shoot one with Salvo, shoot it with Venatari. You may or may not kill it, and then you can charge it with the bikes, and that probably should always kill at least one knight. The problem is you're going to end up almost certainly in a bad position in terms of you know, you're going to be out of your Vex after you make the charge. You know, obviously bikes never get cover. You're probably not going to be obscured from a position that they can get to, so you're going to get shot a lot, and you may also get charged after that. So you may lose both of your hammer units in exchange for one knight, and that is it's usually not a good play because the rest of your units are going to be something like Shield Guard and Sagittarium and I don't know what else, but they're not going to do very much to a knight at all, and then you may just end up getting tabled there. So the next matchup is Custodes. So obviously this is going to be a medium matchup because it's a mirror match. Key units I think are Telemons, Venatari, Bikes, Vex, and Terminators, strangely. These are our key units as well. I tend to think the army with more Telemons is probably favoured because Custodes are going to struggle a lot with killing a Telemon, and if a Telemon can't die, it's going to get into melee as well, and it's going to do pretty good in melee. And if you do manage to get a Telemon to ever tag a bike unit, that's probably game winning because they can't fall back, they don't reroll they don't reroll wounds, they don't shoot, so it's really good. If somebody has a Vex and Terminators, this makes the Telemon football blocker stratagem really good because again, Custodes are going to struggle to kill a Telemon against themselves. Which means you get to get the Vex Homer off, and so that means if they have Terminators in Deep Strike, they have a Vex and they have a Telemon, and you don't, you should really be staying very far away from the Vex unless you want to give them an auto charge, and even with Tanglefoot, you know, a 3-inch charge just isn't that hard to make, I think. So let's go to the next matchup. Space Marines. This isn't like a full matchup thing. This is more a discussion of kind of what generic army lists look like. They're typically going to have a chaplain for buffs. They're typically going to have Inceptors for value because Inceptors are just really good. They're probably going to have Eradicators for value. They're almost certainly now going to have attack bikes with multi-melters. I think there's a shift away from Eradicators into attack bikes with multi-melters in Space Marines generally. But you're probably going to see at least one or the other, if not both. And Whirlwinds. I think every Space Marine faction should probably take a Whirlwind, unless they have some sort of ineligible to fight mechanic through psychic powers or relics or warlord traits or something like that. And typically you're going to see at least one unit of Vanguard Vets, because Vanguard Vets are really good. So a generic key units into Space Marines are Telemons, Venatori. Venatori just murder Space Marines of all varieties. And Vexilla Magnifica, because Space Marines tend to always have pretty good shooting, unless you run into, I don't know, like White Scars or something where they go super melee focus. But even then, it's still good because they're still going to have some shooting, and that shooting is still going to be pretty efficient. The plan really is superior fire patterns with Venatori. This is a bit of a meme if you don't get it, but you know, you literally just do this and you profit. You can just delete squads with Venatori. If you deep strike them, you have to think, you know, what will you realistically be able to shoot in turn 2? Can you get screened out from being able to shoot any good targets, in which case it might be better to start them on the board, just blast them off primaries. You know, if you can get them to a place where they get to superior fire patterns and now nothing else can shoot them or charge them, that's really good, because next turn you move and you do the same thing again. So you're just deleting units with impunity with Venatori. I know some people that were running 2 squads of 5 Venatori, and obviously that made the Space Marines match up very, very easy for them. But now I'm not sure that people should be running 2 squads of 5 Venatori, even if it does make the Space Marine matchup a lot easier. So something to keep in mind is that Space Marine armies rely a lot on rerolls for the efficiency. You know, so they have like the captain rerolling ones, the lieutenants rerolling ones for wound, the chaplain giving rerolls in combat, the chapter master rerolls, you know, things like this. So Auspice gets really a lot of efficiency here, and I think Grim Responsibility has a bit of extra value, particularly into Space Marines, because they have a lot of Strength 5. So like heavy bolters and power swords in their blade guard, things like that. So let's go into a more specific one, Salamanders. I think this is also a pretty medium matchup. So their key units are aggressors. Obviously, Salamanders get +1 to win with Flamer and Melter. They have stratagems to do max shots with their aggressors. When you combine these two things, aggressors can straight up delete your units, because while they don't have the greatest of AP, even in tactical, they will just force an incredible amount of saves, and you will still lose models. They can, you know, they could kill a Telemon if it's been chipped down a little bit. So aggressors are actually really scary here. They're going to have attack bikes with multi-melters and eradicators with multi-melters, because obviously they get +1 to win with Salamanders. That's really good. They're probably going to have Plasma Interceptors anyway, because they have a +1 to win strat generically in their army, which is very strong. They may or may not have the toughness 7 captain on bike, also very tough. And I typically see at least 1 unit of Blade Guard in Salamanders. So our key units here are again kind of the same as into generic Space Marines. Telemon, really good for, you know, absorbing charges, taking hits, being a threat, moving up the board, forcing them to shoot it, which means they're not shooting at other units. Venatori, because they're still Marines. Aggressors don't have invul saves. You know, Inceptors don't have invul save. You know, Eradicators don't have invul saves. So shooting into them with Venatori is always really good, and obviously Vex to make their shooting less efficient. So the plan here is don't let aggressors overwatch. You have to shoot the aggressors. You can't really shoot into them. You can kind of heroic into them, I guess. But your priority really should be trying to shoot the aggressors off the board. And also just be mindful of self-sacrifice when deploying and when you're planning out your turn 1, because you might be thinking, okay, fine, let's kill the aggressors turn 1, but actually they're not the closest unit, and they're not the closest visible unit, and they use self-sacrifice with another unit, and now you can't shoot the aggressors, which can leave you in a very, very bad spot. If you had planned to move to a certain place, you plan to shoot something off the board and then, you know, charge something else, and actually now you can't do that. It's kind of a gotcha. Depending on your opponent, they may or may not tell you about that when you deploy, especially if you talk through what you plan to do turn 1. But if you don't, you know, you don't talk through what you plan to do, you just try and do it turn 1, and they say, you know, at the start of the shooting phase, they go, I do self-sacrifice. This can definitely lose you the game. So just something to be mindful of. White Scars, I think, is also a medium kind of matchup. Their key units are going to be their Chaplain, I think, and Plasma Inceptors, because they get to advance and shoot with no penalty, and Vanguard Vets. They're going to have so many Vanguard Vets, because Vanguard Vets and White Scars are really good. Our key units into White Scars still don't change. Talamon's still really good for being durable. Vanguard Vets with Lightning Claws, they're going to be wound on 6s re-rolling, and if you turn off the re-rolls, it's just not that good. If they go +1 to wound re-rolling, you're still pushing them to 5, so that's still pretty good as well. You will take a lot of damage, but you won't die, and you'll get to swing back, you'll get to shoot in your next turn. So it's still, I think Salamanders is still really good into White Scars. You definitely need units to absorb a charge into White Scars. And to a certain extent, I think probably even 5 Shield Guard are probably pretty good here into White Scars. Units of 3 not so much, because you're going to lose so much when they charge you, and they will charge you, you won't get to charge them. Because they fly, you can't tangle foot, and they have way faster movement than you with advance and charge, and they fly. But yeah, unit of 5 Shield Guard is not terrible here. And the Vexilla is again good, because they, even though they're an assault army, they're still going to have some elements of shooting on their list. The plan here is shoot them as much as humanly possible. And if you do get enough shooting done in turns 1 and 2, and you've managed to avoid being charged, and you're not too scared that you've been completely buried in primary points, you can just win actually if you have enough shooting, because they won't have enough units to kind of threaten the rest of your army. What you can't let them do is, on a scenario where they don't actually need to do that much to fight for the primaries, they can just hang out on their home objectives, and you just staring at each other. You've got similar secondaries, you don't need to be that interactive, and you've got similar primary points because it's a 3-3 map. You don't want to let them turtle until turn 3, and the reason is on turn 3 they get +1 damage wide in Assault Doctrine, and if you haven't kind of started trading army with them in previous turns, and they get to attack you with everything at once, with 2 or 3 Vanguard Vet squads that are completely full health, and they have +1 damage, I don't think you can weather that storm even with Telemons. I think it's just way too much. So you have to foresee this scenario happening, and you have to kind of force the pace a little bit to get them into engagement, to force them into combat, to get angles to shoot them, even if it means they get to shoot you back. So another kind of hard matchup, I think, is Necrons, and I think like 70% of the Necrons I face, of the good ones, are pre-game move and OBSEC. And I think this is a very, very hard matchup if they go first, because everything is going to be all over the primaries to begin with. They may even be on your primaries if they want to go that way. They can stop your banners going up, which means you can never take banners against a pre-game move OBSEC Necrons list, because if they do go first, you'll never get banners up, or you'll score like 3 points. It's really, really bad. So their key units are Wraiths, Scarabs. They're going to have probably 2-3 units of 5 Wraiths. They're going to have 2-3 units of 9 Scarabs. They're going to have a Warrior Blob or 2 with Gorse Reapers. They may or may not have Silent King. Typically, you will see Silent King. They're going to have the Chronomancer, the guy who gives them the 5-up pinball and the reroll charges. So our key units here are Venatori, I think, massively, because you just need stuff that can kill a lot of units, right? So Venatori, really good at killing Scarabs, really good at killing Warriors, pretty good at killing Wraiths, and you just need that shooting output. I think the Talamon in particular is okay into Necrons, unless they have Nightbringer, and the reason is Nightbringer can typically one-shot a Talamon, even with strats. You can save one if they roll slightly bad, and it's a really big swing turn if you dump 3 CP into trying to save your Talamon. No rerolls and wound on 3s, but they're going to still hit on 2s and wound on 3s, and then you're going to save on 6s. Depends how much chip damage they've done to your Talamon, but they could roll high, they could roll low. If you dump all that CP and your Talamon still dies, really, really bad. If you spend the CP and your Talamon lives and gets to do 3 damage to Nightbringer, that's probably game for you, because that means next turn you'll be able to kill Nightbringer by shooting and charging, because he should have less than 6 wounds left. So it's a bit of a it's a bit iffy whether a Telamon is always good into Necrons, and I think it's going to depend on whether they have Nightbringer or Silent King. Palace, I think, is really good into Necrons in general because it has multi-shot and you have 3 damage versus stuff like Wraiths, even though they get a 4-up invul versus it. If they happen to bring kind of Scorpec units for whatever reason, because they don't have an invul save, Palace here is amazing. But the other kind of thing is, they can do the disperse profile if they want to into warriors, and they'll be able to get 3 damage onto Nightbringer. So even if you kind of have to YOLO the Palace to somewhere where it's 100% going to die, it's probably worth it if you can get 3 damage onto Nightbringer, because even though he's going to heal 1, it sets you up to kill at turn 3. Whereas if you don't get any damage onto it turn 1 because it just jumps from obscuring to obscuring, you won't kill it till turn 4, and having Nightbringer alive until turn 4 is really, really scary. So one tech thing is 5 Shield Guard can probably absorb a charge from Nightbringer, and that is you transhuman and you turn off rerolls and you save on 5s, and you probably get 1 or 2 Shield Guard that are going to live, and they get to swing back, and you probably get 3 damage onto Nightbringer. And again, this is the same sort of thing with the Telamon, where getting 3 damage on their turn means you get to shoot and kill it in your turn. And because Nightbringer is pretty expensive, it's kind of worth the trade. I don't think good Necron players are typically charging Shield Guard for this reason, but it's unclear. It's happened enough times that it's worth kind of baiting a charge onto Nightbringer with Shield Guard. So the plan here is to do chip damage to the units and then use a big unit, a unit with big output, to try and wipe it out so they don't get to reanimate. Sometimes people will shoot their Venatori first into the warrior blob, or the Scarab Swarm, and they're left with 1 model left or 2 models left. And now they get to reanimate, so you lost all that value, and then they try to chip it down with the incidental shooting, but they've reanimated so many units that your chip damage doesn't kill it. So obviously do the chip damage first and then try and wipe them out. Also, expect to be tied up in your backfield if they go first. They can just blob you with Wraiths and Scarabs and take up all over the primary. And how the Necron army functions in this list is basically get an early lead on points. If they took Purge the Vermin, if they lock you in your deployment zone, obviously they're scoring massive points there as well. You tend to kill most of their army, but they tend to have such a point lead that you can't catch up. And then be mindful of reanimation protocols. So if they're near an objective and you don't want them to have it, for example, or you don't want them to flip an objective, be very careful about shooting Necron units, because the way that they reanimate now in 9th versus 8th is they can just chain out really far. They just have coherency rules. They don't have to be coherent within the existing units before reanimation. So just keep that in mind. I think if you go first, the matchup is very significantly easier for you versus them going second. But I think it's still a hard matchup. So Harlequins. This is, again, a hard matchup. If you don't have any vehicles for whatever reason, it's a much easier one, I think. If you have 3 units of 5 Shield Guard for whatever reason, and you think that's good, this makes the Harlequins matchup much, much easier. So their key units are bikes with Haywire. The Troop Master will just murder a lot of things. It's giving reroll wounds, and it's got 3 damage, and it's doing I think 2 mortal wounds when it completes a charge. It's getting additional attacks based on what turn it is. These things are monsters in combat. And the Shadow Seer, because it's giving Twilight Pathways, which is effectively warp time, and they're making their units minus 6 inches, and a lot of your guns are 18, 24 inch range. And what this can result in is is they can shoot you and you can't shoot them because of range disparity. Obviously, the bikes are very good at killing vehicles with Haywire, and our expensive units, they pay, even though they're efficient, they pay a lot for their toughness and their armor save. And Haywire kind of skips all that by going straight into mortal wounds output, which you can mitigate somewhat with Indomitable Engines for the 5-up Feel No Pain, but it's still very painful to lose a Telamon a turn to 2 units of 5 bikes. So our key units actually here are bikes, and I think Hurricane bikes are by far better than salvo bikes into Harlequins. Although typically, again, you're unlikely to have a unit of 3, 4, 5 Hurricane bikes in your list. Sagittarium and Venatori good because again it's just about volume shots, trying to kill the little dudes. Even though they've got 4-up involves, you want just as many shots as possible going into them. Because although they're very squishy, they are very fast because they have advance and charge. I think they move like 7 or 8 inches each. They can twilight pathways, and they get like 4 attacks in a charge, and yeah, they will blend you in combat if they get all the charges off. So Shield Guard are really good here because they can absorb a charge. They don't mind the drive-by fusion pistol shooting from their boats. I think Telemons and vehicles are a liability. Yeah, just because the Haywire is so good into us. And units of 5 I think are better than the units of 3 because even if we do get charged, we get to swing back and we might still be able to wipe the unit if we have enough models left. Whereas when you've got a unit of 3, they might all die, or you might be left with like 1 dude left, and that's just not going to do enough damage back to them to be combat effective. So the plan here, I think, is you need to just mentally accept that you won't control the engagements. You're not realistically going to get a charge off onto them unless it's a counter charge. And they're very likely going to be able to shoot you, and you won't be able to shoot them back because of the -6-inch aura from the Shadow Seer. And I think you need to really get them into a grindy sort of a game rather than trying to play a perfect game, because you can't play a perfect game against Harlequins. It's not possible with the movement that they have versus you. So even if you hold kind of primary points at the moment, like let's say you're holding it with like, I don't know, a Telemon or something, they can still take this from you. So I think what the good players will do is they'll charge you with a boat into your Telemon, and you'll think, what's going on? You're going to kill this boat, and yes, you will kill this boat, and then they'll emergency disembark onto the objective, and they'll have obsec and you won't, and they will flip this primary, and they will do this all game long, and as a result you will get buried on primary. So you have to be very, very aggressive in moving up, and you have to accept certain bad positions and openings that you've given the Harlequin opponent, but you just want to be fighting for all these primaries, and Harlequins will score, engage on all fronts effortlessly. They can do scramblers if they want to, although I don't think they typically do it. Yeah, but they'll take stuff like domination and things like that. So they're going to score very highly on secondaries as well. So you really have to fight for all the points that you can on primary. And if you can at all, try and force the Harlequins to make multiple charges so you can get interrupts in. And this is just to effectively allow you to kind of trade army with them, because they are still made of paper, even though they have 4-up involves. So yeah, it's a rough matchup for sure, and the less vehicles you have, the easier it is for you. So let's look at Chaos Demons. Typically you're looking at something like, I don't know, 3 Keepers of Secrets, a bunch of Nurglings, advanced deploying onto primaries. You might have some Seekers because they're also really fast and they tie you up. They may or may not have some horrors. You typically see that more in the TJ Lannigan type list. And a bunch of Demonettes, which are obsec, and they can still kind of fight. And they may or may not have a Lord of Change, because that thing's just really hard to kill. It does a bunch of mortal wounds to you. So our key units in this matchup are the Sisters of Silence. You may or may not run them in your list, depending on how much Psychic you have in your meta. Against Chaos Demons, I think Sisters of Silence, really good unit for, again, the -1 to cast, and the hard deny, and the Creeping Dread if you want to do it. And, every once in a while, being able to target psychic characters is really nice, and rerolling wounds can be really nice. And Creeping Dread even can be pretty useful because it it's an aura effect, so can reduce a lot of incoming melee damage. The Colexus, I don't typically run it in take all comers list, but again, because Chaos Demons are so psychic heavy, if you are able to kind of tailor your list, Colexus is good because it's -2 to cast. It can never be targeted for psychic powers, same as the Sisters. And if you do manage to get it to Hurricane, you can make something, I think, fight last. Rhinos, I think they've kind of fallen out of the meta now, but it's still nice because you can move block some things, because Keepers are are kind of monsters. They can't go through breachable. And they can absorb the smites by being the closest visible, and it's obviously a very cheap model for, I think, 10 wounds or something, so you don't mind if this thing gets smited. You're absolutely fine sacrificing this rhino to move block them to prevent a charge, or getting movement and eating the smites. It's all very good. Into demons, I think hurricane bikes are probably better than salvo bikes, but again, you're probably taking salvo bikes because the Custodes army suffers so much in trying to bring enough anti-tank shooting that you're probably taking salvo bikes over hurricane bikes because you just don't have the points in the slots to otherwise fit in your anti-tank shooting. But if you were able to bring hurricane bikes, this is obviously super good into demons because they don't typically have good saves and you just want a lot of shots, especially if you're trying to kill demonettes, horrors, nurglings, etc. Venatari, I don't think they have super special value into Chaos Demons, but you're likely to have them in your list anyway. There's a lot of T3 in Chaos Demons, and superior fire patterns are still good. So while you're typically wasting the +2 damage, unless you're shooting at it like a greater demon, wounding things on 2s because lots of stuff as T3 is really good. So the plan is you're going to be taking probably a lot of mortal wounds and a lot of psychic shenanigans. So if you have Sisters and Calexis or a Rhino, it's going to help up the matchup a lot versus if you went for pure efficiency in terms of killing output and not having any Sisters, not having any Calexis, not having any Rhinos, that kind of a thing. It's not to say it's an impossible matchup, but it does definitely make your life easier if you have at least just even one unit of Sisters of Silence here. Or one Rhino. Okay, and now let's look at kind of Magnus lists, which are, I think most of them are variations on TJ Lannigan's list. So their key units are going to be Magnus. They're going to have the Lord of Change with the Impossible Robe and all the things that make him extremely hard to kill along with Magnus. They're going to have a unit of horrors either for hardcore screening with the reinforcement points to split, and they're going to have Nurglings for pre-advance advanced deploy kind of units onto primaries, and they're going to have the change caster for the 6-up feel no pain. And once they buff Magnus becomes like 3-up invul, -1 to hit. He has powers to heal himself, and Magnus is just going to do a ton of mortal wounds to you, and Super Smite is going to go off semi-reliably against you. And if you've never been hit by 12 mortal wounds in Super Smite, you probably don't respect the ability of Magnus to get that Super Smite off. So our key units here again are things like Sisters, Calexis, Rhino, Hurricane Bikes to a certain extent, I guess, and again the Venatari as well. So really, if you haven't teched anything into anti-Psyker, this can definitely be a rough matchup, because even if you just have a bunch of Dreadlocks and Telemons, you are still going to eat a ton of mortal wounds, and it's not you end up paying a lot of points per wound on these models, because all the mortal wounds kind of bypass all the things you pay for, like toughness and armor saves, etc. If you do go fast against Magnus, it's obviously super beneficial, because if you do have any significant long-range shooting, which sometimes can be difficult to fit into a Custodes list, you get to get a bunch of damage off onto Magnus before he gets the -1 to hit and the 3-up invul. Just one thing to keep in mind is if you're not going to get a lot of damage onto him, maybe don't bother, because he can just heal himself and just kind of shrug it off. And then turn 1, you probably need to be killing Nurglings off primaries, just so you don't get buried in primary and you might not be able to reach them all to charge them, etc. So yeah, I think this matchup just really depends on how much anti-psychic you have in your list. And if you haven't teched any of it, and these aren't lists that you are not facing, I guess you still don't have to worry about it. But if you are struggling against kind of psychic heavy lists, knowing that this kind of exists kind of should make you really consider whether you want to add in at least, even if it's just one Sisters of Silence unit, can help quite a lot here. Okay, so let's have a look at AdMech. I think AdMech are a pretty hard fight for Custodes. So their key units are, they're going to have the Dominus, they're going to have the Warlord trait for exploding 6s, they're going to give the Aura of reroll 1s, the Daedalosis is going to give +1 to hit versus one of your units. They're going to have Serbi Raiders for the pre-game move, and the Tactica Obliqua, which means you can't charge them, they'll just run away. And while that sounds annoying in itself, what they'll do is they'll set up, if you don't kill these Serbi Raiders, they'll set up the Serbi Raiders on a unit that you actually do want to charge, and they'll make it in such a way that you have to declare onto both if you want to be able to charge the unit you actually want to charge, and then they will use the stratagem for 2 CP to run away, and that will make your charge fail because you didn't get into combat with both the units that you declared into. So this is the reason why Serbi Raiders still have to die. They are incredibly cheap for what they do and the movement that they give you, and I think Admech without Serbi Raiders is just not even a top tier faction. It effectively just allows them to get a whole extra turn of shooting, a ton of their stuff not being shot, very often a primary advantage going into the game, and they're just so efficient for their points with the 6-up invul as well. The Archaeopters Fuselav, they're going to go forwards. They're not going to be that scary in terms of their shooting into Custodes, but what they will do is they will drop bombs. If you have squads of 5, that can be kind of painful because you're going to take 2 or 3 mortals. If you have min squads, it's going to hurt a lot less, but they'll turn off your auras. And the one they're probably going to go straight for is your Vexilla Magnifica, because Admech are a shooting faction. And losing your -1 to hit is really painful. They're typically going to have 3 Scorpius. They may or may not have the energy cannons or the bigger kind of guns that require direct line of sight. I think versus Custodes, the bigger guns are way more scarier, because -2 AP just isn't that great into Custodes, especially if we can get light cover saves. And they're going to have some Electro Priests in I forgot what the transport is, but they're kind of flying transport. These are the guys that you really want to make sure that they don't get to finish a unit off, because once they get the improved invul save, they are going to be an absolute pain in the arse to kill unless you have Venatori, Hurricane Bikes, or both, because they're going to get 2-up invuls on objectives. You can definitely chip through them, but it will take you a really, really long time. Iron Striders are really good. They can buff them up a lot with, bonuses to hit and wound, etc. And robots. You don't see the robots that often, but if you do run into a robot list and the map terrain is unkind, and or they can get the robots into a central location where your army is nowhere near it to set up for a charge, and they have good lines of sight onto your army or the primaries, you've probably lost. So the key units here are Vexilla Magnifica, because obviously they're a shooting army. -1 to hit is really strong. Talamons, really, really good, except into the robots. The robots with Wrath of Mars Mortal Wound spam will just delete Talamons. Even with your 5-up Feel No Pain versus Mortal Wounds, they just die. Venatori are good because they fly and they move fast and they have good shooting, and the same with Salvo Bikes. So the plan, turn 1, is you're going to want to kill Serbi Raiders if they went first, because otherwise they're going to score more. And even if you do charge them and they run away, and you still probably always want to do that to force them to spend the CP, you can probably just run away to another objective, to be honest. You need to kill the Archaeopters, so you regain your aura. And you really want to kill them in shooting rather than having to commit like Venatori or Salvo Bikes to charging them, because they can force them to blow up, and then they're getting more mortal wounds onto you, so it's just even more value for them from the Archaeopter. Try and stay out of priest charge range. Obviously they don't get miracle dice, so you can kind of control that a lot better, and you've got Tanglefoot as well. So just try and keep that in mind. You want to never ever give them 2-up invul saves on objectives. That's really, really tough to deal with. And the robots, you really want to kind of shoot them so that they don't get like a full squad of 3, 4. If they have 5 in a good firing lane, that's just game. Because you can never, like, if the terrain doesn't allow you to approach that to charge it or something, like, it's nothing you can do. They just delete your army. It's the same sort of situation as versus a custom stomper from Orks. If you don't have the right terrain to hide and approach it, it's a point and click adventure, and your army gets deleted. Very, very sad. So Admech is still a very hard matchup, even if they don't have the robots in the right position, because they have just a lot of good shooting, and you don't get to shoot their shooting units because you need to kill the Archaeopters and the Raiders first. Otherwise you get buried in primary, and you still have to worry about the priests. So very, very hard matchup. So Venatori and Salvo Bikes, what you really, in my experience, what you need to do against a really good opponent is you need to shoot something and set up a charge to wrap, and you really want to wrap something like a tank. because their tanks and transports don't fly anymore, and if you can pin them against terrain or you have enough models left to just try and wrap them, if they don't have CP, to use the stratagem to work at top profile, and you kind of bracket them, and now because the model is quite big, they can't get out of your engagement range. That can allow you to kind of hide for a turn in the middle of the board where you might not have terrain that would allow you to otherwise hide. And you typically need to do something like that to be a good AdMech player in my experience. Okay, another kind of AdMech list is Data Hoard. I think this is also very hard. I discovered this list by playing Damien Owen, who won the Atlanta GT. I didn't know who he was until afterwards. I just got ruined by this list and was like, oh, it's really strong. And he said, oh, don't feel bad. I won a GT with it. And then I felt better. Anyway, so this list has about 27 Cataphrone breaches. They'll be in Data Hoard, so they are typically going to take the 6-up Feel No Pain, which makes flat damage 3 pretty inefficient into them. And they're going to get exploding 5s and 6s on the heavy arc weapons because they're all going to take heavy arc rifles. So that's also really strong because that makes their shooting really scary. They're still going to have a lot of the Serbi Raiders and the Archeolog Fusiliers, but what they've done is they've traded their Scorpiuses and robots for the Cataphrone Breaches, which are upsec. And they're still going to get all the bonuses to hit, etc. If you have vehicles, it's bad because these heavy arc rifles will do D6 instead of D3 into vehicles. So even though you might have 3, 4, 5 dreadnoughts or whatever, and you think, oh, -1 is good, them going to D6 means they're all still going to die. So Vexilla Magnifica is still good to deter the shooting, but this is a lot of shooting coming your way. One of the units that is opportunistically good are Terminators into this list, because I think it's AP2. If you can get a Vex Homer off into the breaches, that can help. That can win the game for you. What you do need to do is charge through obscuring, so you don't take the Overwatch, because they're going to Overwatch on I think 5s, I think. Or with the exploding stuff, it's the Overwatch is still not something you want to take, and even if you do get into combat, they still have the claws. They still hurt in combat as well, so you're gonna need it. You're gonna effectively need to charge them through terrain to do good here. So yeah, charge them behind obscuring. You have to clear the Serbi Raiders, and you have to shoot the Archaeopters. I think it's still a pretty ugly matchup into most Custode lists, if I'm honest. So let's have a look at Dark Angels. Their key units are their Obsec Terminators. I think this codex is really, really strong, and I think they're slightly overtuned, and I think they should be nerfed slightly, but I don't think people want to hear me whine about Dark Angels codex. So Obsec Terminators with Perma Transhuman turns out it's really strong when in 9th GT holding primaries is really important. They're also going to have the Chapter Ancient for the -1 damage banner. Thankfully it's targeted, not on aura. They've got really good librarian powers, like Righteous Repugnance is like having an extra chaplain basically. They can make you I think it's fight last or ineligible to fight, and they can cancel your any actions that you're doing. So the librarian powers I think are really strong. Their bikes are just better than all the other Space Marine bikes and the Ravenwing detachments because they get Jink and they can move and advance in Dev. And Weapons of the Dark Age just means if they do take Plasma, they get a straight +1 damage to it, which means they can go to damage 3 with a lot of things, which is again one of our nasty breakpoints for Custodes because we don't have any Feel No Pains. So our key units into Dark Angels are still Telemons because they're just very durable. Venatori are still good into Marines, but if they've gone very Terminator heavy with Storm Shields and light cover, Venatori become a weakness because everything you can still kill everything that isn't a Terminator with a Storm Shield in light cover pretty efficiently with Venatori. But if that's all they have, because they're going to save on 2s, it makes the Venatori really not so good. Vexilla Magnifica is, if they've gone pure Terminator, this is a dead unit. It doesn't do anything because they just don't have any shooting worth discussing. But they typically will have a Raven Wing detachment as well. And so the Vexilla is still pretty good, gets less value. I think bikes here of any variety are really good into Dark Angels because you get to reroll wounds on the charge versus Transhuman, and that's one of the really only one of the real ways that we can get efficiency versus Dark Angel's Transhuman. And you'll notice that bikes are in some units they're good, in some units they're bad, and into a lot of other matchups they're kind of like middling. But into Dark Angels in particular, this is definitely one of the ones where they're really good. And Trajan, you can take a view as to whether you should always have him or sometimes have him in your lists. Versus Dark Angels is also really good because you get to reroll 1s to wound against Transhuman. And just for that, he's worth mentioning in what our key units are. So turn 1, you probably just want to kill all their Ravenwing units. You want to stop them getting engaged if they have it. You want to stop them outscoring primary. And if you reduce the army to just the Terminators, they're really slow. And depending on how much shooting you have, you can just decide, are you going to try and shoot them off the objectives while staying out of their charge range or not? But, obviously killing their Ravenwing units is way easier than killing their Terminators. Especially because they're probably going to have the -1 damage banner, and they're probably going to have the Apothecary, which means your chip damage doesn't count because they get to heal 2 separate units and they get to bring a model back. So I would work on just destroying outright their Ravenwing units first, turn 1. And because it's a slow army, try and pick off isolated units where you can with your fast units like bikes with Vanitari. What you want to do is avoid a situation where you charge 5 Terminators with 5 bikes and you smash them and you feel good about yourself, but actually that leaves you in very easy counter charge range of another unit of Terminators who get to just pick up your entire bike unit, or kill 3 or 4 of them, because that is no longer a good trade. The other thing is, because Dark Angels have access to the generic Space Marine secondaries like Oath of Moments, and they also have Stubborn Defiance, which is a crazy secondary. I don't think this should be in the game either. It's really bad. It's really easy for the army to get 15 points most games as a secondary, and it's really uninteractive for the opponent, and they can just park 5 Terminators on it all game, and that's just giving them 15 secondary points. So you can kind of turn that into a trap. So if you have a unit of 5 bikes and you keep them in a spot where next turn you could move and charge that relatively easily. So let's say you keep them 14 plus 6 or 7 inches away. What this can do, because your bikes are obsec and their Terminators are obsec, if they've only protected it with 5 Terminators, if you do that, you are effectively threatening to take them off that Stubborn Defiance objective. They might not realize it. If they don't realize it, that's also fine. You can just go for that move. And if you get to shoot them as well, you're probably just going to wipe out the squad or leave them on 1, and it's your objective and you've taken them off it. And the way that Stubborn Defiance scoring works is, if you interrupt that scoring, it really punishes them pretty heavily. So now it's not 15, they might only score like 7 or 8 on it now, and that could win you the game. So, but on the other hand, if they do recognize the fact that your bikes could go on their Stubborn Defiance objective, you can force them to overprotect that objective with another squad. And what that will do is allow you to actually change your plan and go somewhere else with the bikes. I just think having bikes into Dark Angels matchup is really, really helpful. And obviously, Melter is better than Hurricanes here. So let's go into another very hard matchup. And this is Death Guard with no Mortarion. And typically what I tend to see are triple Contemptors with double Volkite. And they will take the inexorable play company, where something within their contagion aura, they gain -1. You gain -1 against it. Contemptors do a lot of mortal wounds, but they have no AP. But you put Tallyman next to it and make one of them hit on 1s, and they all get exploding 6s, and you give somebody to reroll the 1s, and now they have AP 1 and the damage 2. They will start doing a lot of wounds to you, and they can pick up a Telemon. And they can pick up a lot of your Custodes units. And unless you have long-range anti-tank shooting to be able to kill the Contemptors, you are going to take a lot of shooting damage just from these 3 Contemptors. The Foul Blightspawn is another hugely problematic unit, because the Foul Blightspawn is going to be bodyguarded by some Death Shrouds, and you can't kill the Death Shroud because the Death Shroud have access to Cloud of Flies, which means you can't even shoot the Death Shroud, which means you can't shoot the which means you know if you can't kill the Death Shroud, you can't kill the Foul Blightspawn, which means if you get into combat, they're going to make you fight. They're going to make you ineligible to fight, which means the Death Shroud gets to strike first into combat. And Death Shrouds in combat are really good. So this Foul Blightspawn by himself causes a ton of problems. The Terminators and Death Guard are all super efficient. If you compare Custode Terminators versus Death Guard Terminators, you'll start feeling bad really quickly. And Poxwalkers, I think they will always have, you know, like between 20 and 40 Poxwalkers in a list. They're really good. They're really cheap. They're really durable because they're T4 and 6 up Feel No Pain. And then you're going to have probably 2 Plague Burst Crawlers. And these are really good because they're really hard to kill. They're going to sit in the backfield. They've got really good range. And they're going to be like one of their while we stand we fights. And because of the way that the army works, they're not super high priority for you to kill, which means they're probably going to score, you know, 5, 10, 15 points for while we stand we fight. And there's not a lot you can do about it because unless you've steamrolled the army, which is really hard to do, you're probably never going to kill the Plague Burst Crawlers. And all the time, you know, they're I forgot what their last cannon equivalent shot is really good into us. And the Plague Burst Crawler can do the mortars with the +1 wound, and then they can do mortar wounds to everything around the unit that they hit. And Custodes don't like taking mortar wounds. So overall, it's just a really, really rough matchup. So our key units are again the Vexilla, because this is kind of a shooting list that has counterpunch and ineligibility to fight. The Ares here is one of these matchups where it's really good if you have it, but you probably don't have an Ares in all your lists because it's really bad into a lot of other matchups. So this is one of these situational picks where if you happen to have an Ares in your list, this isn't so hard at all. The Palace is good because it moves fast, you can get to a lot of places, and the beam profiles is pretty good into everything. Not so much the Death Shrouds, but like if they have Plague Marines or, you know, even Poxwalkers, it's, you know, re-rolling versus vehicles is pretty good. Aractus Heavy Blaze Cannon. Again, a unit that you're typically not going to have in your list, but if you do have it in your list and you have 2 of them, or even 3 of them, it's going to make the matchup much easier because you just get to blast the Contemptors out, especially if you get turn 1 and you've got line of sight. Can make the matchup much, much easier. And Telemons, always still good, even though they will die to the Volkite Contemptors, especially if you get into contagion range, so you're saving on 3s instead of 2s, but it also just depends how they spike on their mortar wound onto the Telemon, and also the Plague Burst Crawlers and all sorts of things. So I think Death Guard in general, even if it's not this particular kind of list, is still very difficult for Custodes because they've just got army-wide -1 damage reduction. And obviously most of our army is flat 2 or D3, and that means we get reduced to 1 or 1.33 on average. So very, very significant reduction in output versus the army. And the problem with the Foul Blightspawn that I mentioned, you know, this unit by itself means, you know, combat against Death Guard is very unfavourable because your hammer unit's just going to be made to fight last. So against this kind of list, I'd try and focus the Contemptors as quick as possible because obviously they're going to do probably the most damage into you. And be careful about shooting Poxwalkers because if they use the stratagem to deadwalk again, they get to roll 7 dice, and on a 3-up, one of them gets to come back to life, and they can string out. And so, you know, you might have thought they're not touching an objective, or they're too far to get an advance, or to likely get an advance. They can just string them out, and now suddenly they're on a primary that you didn't want them to be on. So now let's look at Death Guard lists with Morty. I think this is also hard. I think it's probably slightly easier than the no Morty list, depending on your composition, on your Custodes composition. So they're going to trade the Contemptors for Morty. They're still going to have Tallyman because exploding 6s is good, and hitting on 2s is good, and getting like 3 CP over the course of the game is also really good. They're still going to have the Foul Blightspawn, with the Terminators doing the same trick on the Poxwalkers and the Plague Burst Crawlers. Now, our key unit here versus Mortarion is actually Telemons and Aculus, maybe even Palace. Now, the reason why Telemons and Aculus are good is if you have enough of them, Morty can come in and he can kill something, but you can punch him to death back. Because if you hit him with enough high damage weapons, you don't actually need that many shots anymore. So the problem why most people can't kill Mortarion is, like, you know, they try and kill him with Melter, but if they're not in Melter range, It's doing 3.5 reduced by 1 to like 2.66 after damage reduction. And now you need really a lot of shots. But when your Aculus is hitting for 3 plus D3 or flat 4 with the Telemon, you don't need that many shots to go through to kill him. So this is the reason why if you have a lot of Telemon, if you have like 2 Telemon and 3 Aculus, Morty suddenly doesn't want to play with your arm anymore because he's going to get punched in the face. So again, with a Custode army, I don't think... I really struggle to see, like, unless you high roll, how you're going to one-turn Mortarion in shooting. It's just not happening. So I think you have to decide, do you have enough Dreadnoughts to make the counter-charge threat real? So if he does charge you, you're actually pretty happy because you can delete him and then you just don't have to worry about Mortarion anymore. Or whether he plays cagey and then, you still have to worry about it and you still have to remain kind of balled up. But you have tools to deal with him. But if you don't, you have to decide, if you don't have that many Dreadnoughts, you have to really decide if you think you can kill Mortarion or not. And I think if you don't have the Dreadnoughts and you're not sure, erring on the side of planning to run away from Mortarion all game is actually very valid strategy. I've seen some discussions about people saying, oh, you know what, I'll tag him and tie him up with 5 shield guard and I'll pop all the strats. Yes, I suppose theoretically that can work. The problem with that is a good Death Guard player is not going to stick Morty into shield guard. He's not going to put them anywhere near shield guard, and you need to spend a lot of CP. You're going to have to spend like 4 CP a player turn when you're in combat, otherwise you just get deleted. You can tie him up for a turn, but I don't think that's worth 8 CP, right? You're going to have to turn transhuman, you're going to have to turn off rerolls. So I don't think it's that good. I certainly don't think it's reliable. If you happen to have a list that has like 3 units of 5 shield guard, then I guess maybe, because you're always going to have a unit of shield guard somewhere. But typically, if you're just running like 1 unit of 3, 4, 5, I definitely would not rely on that, because they just never have to go into him at all. And then a special place for Death Guard Soup. And this has Mortarion, and it has Warp Time, and it has Death Hex, and I don't know if people know what Dragon Ball Z is, but back in my days, Ultra Instinct was like the hardest mode, and I think for pure Custodes, this is just so hard to deal with. So the key to this list is the Death Guard will lose their Contagion stratagem, and that's obviously very strong. But I think it's worth losing to access Warp Time onto Mortarion, because the thing with Mortarion is he is very, 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 very hard to kill. Custodes list just is not going to shoot him to death realistically. You don't have mortal wounds strats or any other way. Like, there are a couple of armies that can shoot Morty to death in one turn, and that's fine. But Custodes just isn't one of those lists. And once he gets into melee, he blends everything. So the problem is now, with Warp Time, he becomes extremely durable, extremely blendy, and extremely fast. And no unit is supposed to have that trinity in the game, because it's just way too powerful. But you can have this in the game currently, because you still can Warp Time Mortarion. So there are various ways to do this, but I think the best way that I've come across is... I first saw this combo from EDT. Let me give him a shout out. He has a channel on YouTube called, let me just triple check that I get this name right. The Competitive Standard 40k. I'll link that in the description below. I don't know if he invented it, but it's the first time I came across it, and after I came across it, I saw a whole bunch of other people using it. So if I've credited the wrong person, whatever. But anyway. Shout out to that guy and his channel. So what he does is he takes a Word Bearer Patrol. He takes a Sorcerer that has access to the Dark Hereticus discipline. And this gives him access to Warp Time and Death Hex, because he gets to cast 2. Now, there are some benefits to taking a Word Bearer Patrol in your Death Guard list. And that is, you get access to Chaos Familiar as a strat. And you get to swap a power on a Heretic Astartes Psyker, which Morty is, for Warp Time or Death Hex, which is in the Dark Hereticus Psychana discipline. Additionally, the Word Bearer Sorcerer can use Malevolent Covenant, because it's a Word Bearer's Psyker, and that stratagem says if you fail a Psychic test, it's automatically passed, and it can't be denied by Deny the Witch. So you can imagine how strong it is if you get to do warp time and it can't be denied by Deny the Witch. Right? So you either even if you pass your warp charge test on like a 7 or an 8, you should probably still re-roll it, because you really, ideally, you want to fail it, or you want a higher roll on it. And this makes it very problematic for other armies to deal with. Custodes actually have a few tech ways that they can get around warp time, but it's not common. So obviously Death Hex is not like Null Zone, where it's turning off invols for their own units as well in the aura. It's a targeted 12-inch turn off invols, and that's obviously very bad when you are Custodes army. And so they're going to have, for the rest of their army, they're still going to have the same stuff. They're going to have Tallyman, Foul Blightspawn, some Terminators, some Poxwalkers, and Plague Burst Crawlers. And the Morty and While We Stand We Fight, the Morty and the Plague Burst Crawlers will be the While We Stand We Fights. But what this does do is that it gives the list so much mobility, with Mortarion being able to warp time around and murder everything by himself pretty much. Unless you have lots of Dreadnoughts. So our key units here are still the Telemon and Aculus, probably the Palace, because the Palace can go around and shoot a bunch of things, and you don't mind too much if it dies, and you can use it to move block stuff or prevent landing zones for charges. Now, one of our key tech units are the Sisters of Silence, because Empiric Severance is the hard deny on a 3-up, and the way it's described in the Codex is it's not a Deny the Witch test, because you can take it after a Deny the Witch test. So I think on both interpretations, it's not a Deny the Witch attempt, which means that Malevolent Covenant can be bypassed with Empiric Severance. The other way to do the other kind of tech piece in Custodes is, if you get Death Hexed on a Custodes unit, you can try Fortress of Willpower on a 4-up, which is also a hard deny, because this is also not a Deny the Witch test. It's just a deny strat. So the way that I read it, I think both of these can work against Malevolent Covenant. I haven't seen an FAQ ruling on it. Who knows what the tournament ruling is going to be, if there is one. But I think it's kind of fresh enough that most people aren't aware of the possibilities of these kind of interactions. So something to keep in mind if you happen to come across it in your games, and if your opponents watch, I suppose, this channel, and I've just given them nasty ideas to play against your Custodes list. Sorry about that, but, you know, information goes both ways, I guess. So again, yeah, the plan, you're still unlikely to be able to shoot Mortarion in one turn. And if you do have enough Dreadnoughts, you can make it so that, you know, even if he does have warp time, he probably doesn't want to, because he just gets, he just gets charged by 3 or 4 units next turn, which will kill him. Like 3 Aculus is probably just going to do Morty by himself, but you're going to shoot him a bit first with your army. The problem here is, if you don't have all these Dreadnoughts, you can no longer run away from warp time Morty. So running away from Morty no longer is a plan, and I think this is probably another one of these matchups where if you play pure Custodes and you just don't have an absolute crap ton of dreads, I think you just lose this matchup. And again, I don't think you have to feel bad about what could you have done differently with deployment, secondaries, whatever. I think this is just one of these hard counters to the army, unfortunately. Unless you have, I suppose, Sisters and Calexis, and then, you know, he has trouble casting any of these powers. But then you're still in the same problem of -1 damage, but it's significantly less problematic when you don't have to deal with Death Hex and warp time. And now we get to the conclusions on army composition. This is the last slide, so don't worry. Video's not going on for much longer. So some things to note are, I hope you've realised that some units are coming up again and again as key units into matchups, and I think these are Telemons, Vexilla, and Venatari, and that's because there's almost no matchup really where they're really bad. Obviously the Telemon was bad into Nightbringer, and Venatari are bad into Mass Storm Shields, Terminators, and Light Cover. But as long as you only take 1 unit of Venatari, and I think you probably cap out at 2 Telemons, obviously you're not going to take more than 1 Vex, I think this is a good core to most lists. So it's impossible to have optimal army composition into all matchups. Obviously there are things like Ares which make matchups much easier, but then they make other matchups much harder, because you have 450 points in something that can't kill more than, I don't know, 150 points of of units for the entire game, even if it lives, and etc. So an interesting thing is that the Telemons used to make us weak to Harlequins, but obviously Telemons are really good into Sisters and a bunch of other matchups, but especially into Sisters. But I think with how heavy the meta is with Death Guard and Dark Angels, I think we're going to see less Harlequins, because Harlequins into Death Guard and Dark Angels are also really bad. So I think this makes Telemons just better overall. I think you can never go wrong with adding just a random Telemon into your Custode list if your Custode list happens to be struggling. Obviously, if your list isn't struggling, you don't need to think about changing your list. And I probably think 2 Telemons is optimal for most Custode players, especially if they are struggling. Just try and fiddle with the points to make sure that these land on your While We Stand We Fights, because obviously While We Stand We Fight is one of our secondaries that we can control, and we should be building our lists to be able to take it and have it land on the units that we want. And the Telemon is one of the best units you can land While We Stand We Fight on. I think 2 squads of Venatori now I think are too much, because there's too much damage reduction. There's too much stuff that ignores AP1, AP2. I think people were having a lot of success with it before, just beating up Sisters and Marines with 2 squads of Venatori, but I think now it's just not. It's probably a bit of a liability, and the Ares we've discussed already. I think the bikes are kind of like the Ares in some matchups. It's not as good, but it's not as punishing as taking an Ares into a bad matchup. And I think the only super bad matchup where bikes are really, really bad are into Sisters. But Sisters are, I think, enough of the meta, and you're likely to face them at the top tables, that it's still something to keep in mind as to, do you really want bikes? Because the other thing is, if you take a unit of bikes and they're more than 3, they are certainly going to be one of your While We Stand We Fights, and because they're your hammer unit and you're going to need to use them aggressively all game, you're very likely to lose them over the course of a close match. Obviously, if you're just crushing everybody with your bikes, then they're not going to die, and it's great for While We Stand We Fight, but then you were winning anyway, so it kind of didn't matter. So yeah, as always, kind of build your list for favourable matchups depending on your meta. So, I've said Sisters of Silence can be really good against psychic heavy stuff, but if you don't have any psychic heavy stuff, there's really no reason to put Sisters into your list unless you're going into a tournament, and then you should really think about it again, because you're definitely going to come across some psychic heavy armies over the course of the tournament if you go deep. Anyway, thanks very much for watching to the end. Please don't forget to like, comment and subscribe, and please leave some comments below if you think I'm wrong, or you disagree, or you agree, or in particular let me know if you prefer the longer style of video so you can kind of put it on as a podcast in the background, or you just like to really geek it out over Warhammer and you like the style, or you would really prefer I just make 5-6 minute videos and upload way more often. Anyway, thanks very much, and I'll see you guys next time.